Some people arrive in a place the way snow arrives in mud season, quietly, without announcement, and not at all sure they will stay. Ruth Beiler came to Holmes County on a Thursday in late February on the second bench of a hired van that smelled of pine air freshener and old coffee. She had one trunk, one canvas bag, and a mason jar wrapped in a dish towel and wedged into the corner of her bag, where it would not tip. The jar held a sourdough starter her mother had kept alive for 31 years before the fire, and that Ruth had kept alive for 2 years since, feeding it flour and water every few days the way you care for something that cannot ask to be cared for. She watched Holmes County come to her through the van window. The hills were bare and brown. The fields were soft with mud. The fence rose dark with old ice still caught in the shadows. A line of black buggies moved along the road's shoulder with that particular Amish patience, neither fast nor slow, simply present in the way that plain people are present, as though they have decided that where they are is exactly where they are meant to be, and there is nothing further to debate about it. Ruth had not felt that way in some time. She was not sure, if she was honest, that she had ever felt it easily, even before. She was 29 years old, and she had buried a husband and a mother and a father and a brother in less than 3 years, and the particular arithmetic of that had done something to the way she moved through the world. She did not walk into a room and feel anymore that she belonged to it. She walked in and noticed the exits. She kept her coat on a little longer than needed. She folded the dish towels before putting them down, a habit her mother had called useful, and her husband had called amusing, and that now she simply did, without thinking, without anyone to observe it one way or the other. Her husband's name had been Daniel. He had died on a cold November morning, 18 months ago now, when a wagon on the steep back grade of the Lapp farm had come loose from its brake and he had been below it. He had been helping, the way men in their community helped. He had not suffered long. Ruth had been told this as though it was a kindness, and she had accepted it as one, because by then she had learned to accept things. Her parents had gone in the fire the winter before that. Her brother Amos, who was 24 and strong, and had always seemed like the kind of person the world would keep, had gone in March of that same year with pneumonia. So quickly the doctor had shaken his head, as though apologizing for the speed of it. There was a deaconess in her home district in Mifflin County, a woman named Edna Zook, who had sat with Ruth through all of it, and who had finally, in January, said what she had probably been thinking for some time. She had said it carefully, because Edna Zook was a careful woman. She had said that Ruth was a young woman with good hands and a sound faith, and that grief could be worked through. But it could not be worked through alone in a place where every road and every field reminded her of everyone she had lost. She had a connection in Holmes County, an older couple, the Troyers, who kept a clean spare room and did not ask more of boarders than they freely offered. Ruth had folded her hands in her lap and looked at the floor and said she would think on it. She had thought on it for 3 weeks and then packed her trunk. The Troyer farm was modest and kept with the quiet dignity of old age. Herr Troyer, whose name was Amos, which Ruth noticed and said nothing about, was a small man with a white beard and a deliberate way of moving that suggested he had decided long ago that hurrying was not worth its costs. Frau Troyer, Miriam, was round and warm, and had the eyes of a woman who had seen considerable trouble in her life and come to some agreement with it. She took Ruth's coat and her bag, asked no questions about the mason jar, and put a bowl of soup on the table before Ruth had finished sitting down. The spare room was plain and clean, a single bed, a window that looked east, toward a neighbor's dark field, and beyond it, a slope of bare-limbed trees. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed that first night and did not cry. She had done most of her crying already. Instead, she unpacked her things with care, set the mason jar on the windowsill where the morning light would reach it, and told herself that she was here now, and that here was a place, and that a place was somewhere to begin. She did not sleep well, but she had not expected to. The first Sunday service she attended in the district was held in the home of a family named Coons, whose front room was large enough for folding benches and the serious business of 3-hour worship. Ruth sat with the women and kept her hands folded in her lap and listened to the German of the hymns as it moved through the room like something slow and dense and old, the way water moves through limestone. She didn't know these hymns in quite this way. The Mifflin County district sang the Loblide with a different cadence. Small differences, but she felt them, the way you feel a shoe that is almost right but not quite. She noticed the Schrock family because she would have had to be looking at the floor not to. There were 3 children and 1 man, and the children were arranged along the bench in a way that suggested they had been arranged by someone who understood the importance of arrangement. The youngest, a boy of perhaps 5, sat pressed against his father's side with the absolute trust of small children. The middle child, a girl, sat very straight with her hands folded in a clear imitation of adult composure, and the eldest, a boy of 12 or so, sat with his eyes forward and his back straight, and a particular expression on his face that Ruth recognized before she could have said why. It was the expression of someone doing a job, not a child. Someone doing a job that had been given to him by circumstance. The man beside them was broad-shouldered and still. He held the youngest with one arm without looking down, the way you hold something you have held so often that your body knows the weight of it. Ruth looked away. After the service, Frau Treuer introduced her briefly to several families. She shook hands and gave her name, and said she was from Mifflin County, and smiled in the way that was true enough not to be dishonest, but did not invite further excavation. She met the Schrock family at the edge of the yard, briefly by way of Frau Treuer's quiet orchestration. The man's name was Elias. His handshake was firm and brief, and he looked at her directly, which some men did not, and said it was good to have her in the district. And then one of his children said something behind him and he turned away. And that was the whole of it. Ruth walked home with Frau Treuer through the cold and said it seemed a fine district. Frau Treuer said it was, mostly. She said that Elias Schrock had lost his wife 2 winters past, a good woman named Anna, and that those 3 children were being raised as well as a man alone could manage, which was to say adequately but not entirely. Ruth said that was a sad thing. Frau Treuer said it was. They walked the rest of the way in silence, which was its own kind of companionship. Planting season came the way it always does in Holmes County, not all at once, but in negotiations. Warm days followed by cold snaps, the soil softening and stiffening again in turns, the farmers watching it with the steady patience of people who understand that the ground will be ready when it is ready, and not before. Ruth helped Frau Treuer with the kitchen garden, turning beds and setting early seedlings in the cold frames, her hands relearning the particular ache of that work after a winter of only sewing. She had taken in mending and small sewing commissions from 3 families in the district by April. She worked at the table by the east window where the morning light was good, and the mason jar of starter sat 2 feet from her elbow, and she fed it Tuesday and Saturday without fail. The starter had a smell that was almost alive, yeasty and faintly sour, and she was aware of it in the background of every morning the way you are aware of something breathing in a room. The community meal rotation was informal, the way most things in the district were informal, organized by understanding rather than by announcement. When a family needed it, other families cooked. The Schrocks had not signaled need exactly, but they were on the list that the older women kept in their heads, the way older women in any Amish community keep a running account of who has enough and who could use a little more without it being said directly. It was Frau Troyer who suggested Ruth take the Thursday pot. Ruth made a bean and ham soup, thick enough to carry a person through an afternoon's work, and she baked a loaf of sourdough from the starter, the bread her mother had made, the bread she had been making since she was 7 years old and had to stand on a step stool to reach the counter. The loaf came out of the oven with a dark, crackled crust, and that particular smell that was not just bread, but was, to Ruth, specifically home. She wrapped it in a cloth and put it in the basket beside the soup pot, without ceremony, because what it meant to her was not something she needed anyone else to see. The Schrock farm was 1.5 miles from the Troyers. Ruth walked it in the thin spring sunshine, the basket over one arm, the fields still more brown than green on either side of the road. She could see the harness shop from the road before she reached the house, a low building with a good roof and a hand-lettered sign above the door. The yard was swept clean. The kitchen garden had been turned but not yet planted, the soil dark and ready. She knocked at the door. It was the girl who answered. Miriam, 9 years old, with her mother's quilt of dark hair under her cap and her father's direct eyes. She looked at the basket with frank interest and then up at Ruth. "You're the lady from Troyer's," Miriam said. It was not a question. "I am," Ruth said. "I brought soup and bread." The small boy appeared at Miriam's shoulder from nowhere, the way small children do, as though they materialize from the walls whenever food is mentioned. He looked at the basket, then at Ruth, then at the basket again, with a concentration that was nearly scientific. "Bread," he said. "Jonas," Miriam said with the tone of an older sibling who has appointed herself a standard keeper. Ruth smiled. "You must be Jonas." "Ja," said Jonas with great dignity. She looked past them into the kitchen, which was clean and still in a way that kitchens with small children are rarely still, and she felt it before she could name it. It was a room from which something had been removed. Not recently. Long enough ago that the removal was no longer a wound, but had become instead a shape. The particular shape of an absence that everyone in the household had learned to navigate around. The way you learn to walk around a piece of furniture in the dark. She set the basket on the table and was unpacking it when she heard the door behind her and turned to find the oldest boy in the doorway. He had come from somewhere outside, his boots muddy at the toe, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not unfriendly exactly, more careful than that. Precise. "Levi," said Miriam. "She brought soup." Levi looked at the soup pot and then at Ruth and then at the breadcloth on the table. He said, "Danke," which was thanking her, correctly and properly, and then he went to the far side of the kitchen and sat down in a chair by the window and said nothing else. He did not leave. He stayed where he could see. Elias came in from the shop 20 minutes later, wiping his hands on a rag, and thanked her with the same formal brevity she remembered from the churchyard. He was polite and considered and did not say anything that was more than what was needed. She told him she hoped the children were well. He said they were managing. She said she would see herself out. He said good evening and went to the stove to check the fire, and she picked up her empty basket and walked back through the kitchen, past the chair where Levi still sat watching, and out into the spring evening. She walked back to Troyer's in the long light, and she did not think about it, or she tried not to. She thought about the sourdough, whether she had baked it long enough, whether it would hold up once sliced, whether Jonas would like the crust or leave it, the way some children did. That night at the kitchen table, Frau Troyer talked about the district while she shelled the early peas they'd started in the cold frame. She talked about this family and that family, who was expecting, who had had a hard winter, who was thinking of selling a piece of the farm. She mentioned the Schrock children in passing, said Miriam was a capable girl and little Jonas was a cheerful soul, said Levi was a serious boy who reminded her of his father at that age, which she meant as a compliment. Ruth listened, her hands around her cup of tea. The dish towel from dinner was beside her on the table. Without thinking about it, she picked it up and began to fold it precisely, edge to edge, the way her mother had taught her. She folded it in thirds and then in thirds again and set it flat. She was listening. She was hearing about children who lived in a house shaped like absence, in a home that was clean and sufficient, and missing something she understood without needing to have it explained. Some forms of loneliness, she thought, are only visible to people who carry the same kind. If you are watching this tonight from somewhere that feels too quiet, I want you to know, this one is for you. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from. There are more of you than you think, sitting in rooms that used to be louder. And this story was made with you in mind. The barn raising was held in the second week of June. The Hostetler barn, on the north side of the township, had lost its roof in a May storm, a fast and ugly thing that had come up from the southwest in the night and was gone by morning, leaving 1/2 mile of damage and one perfectly destroyed hay barn in its wake. By Sunday it had been decided. By Wednesday the date was set. By the Tuesday of the raising, more than 60 people were moving across the Hostetler property with the particular purposeful energy of a community that knows exactly what it is doing and has done it before. Ruth came with Frau Troyer and 3 other women from the district. They set up the food preparation in the open yard, well back from the framing work. Long tables with oilcloth covers hauled in from several households. There were cold cuts and pickles and 4 different kinds of potato salad, and a quantity of pies that suggested every woman in the district had made one, and no one had coordinated. Ruth had brought 2 more loaves of sourdough and a pot of the bean soup that seemed, by now, to have become her signature contribution, partly because it was good and partly because it was what she knew. The men worked the frame in shifts, the older ones directing, the younger ones doing the lifting, the whole enterprise moving with a quiet choreography of people who had been doing this together their whole lives. Ruth watched the skeleton of the barn go up across the morning with something that felt unexpectedly like gratitude. There was something about a community that could do this, something that she had not had exactly in Mifflin County, or perhaps had and not seen clearly until it was gone. Elias Schrock was among the men on the frame. She did not look for him specifically. She simply noticed, the way you notice things that your eye has begun to find on its own. He moved carefully and without unnecessary motion, handing a beam, bracing a post, speaking to the man beside him with a word or two and a nod. He did not perform the work. He simply did it. Sadie Yoder was at the food table by mid-morning, bringing coffee out to the men in shifts, a task she undertook with the kind of quiet efficiency that made it look like calling rather than effort. She was a fair woman, 31 years old, with a sensible face and a pleasant manner, and she was well regarded in the district and had been so for as long as anyone could remember. When she brought the first cup to Elias, she said something that made him glance up and nod, once, briefly, a small acknowledgement. It was not a meaningful thing, or it was not more meaningful than it needed to be, but Ruth saw Frau Troyer see it, and the older woman's eyes moved to Ruth for just a moment, checking something, and then moved away. Ruth concentrated on the bread she was slicing. Levi was there with his father, doing the work the older boys did, carrying things, holding things, running messages between the men and the food table with the serious efficiency of a 12-year-old who wants very much to be useful. He came to the table for water 3 times and looked at Ruth each time without expression. And on the 3rd time she handed him the cup before he had to ask, and he took it and said "Denki" and walked away. It was a small thing, but it was something. By late afternoon, the barn frame was up, the roof beginning, the light going golden across the new wood and the green fields. And there was that particular feeling that comes at the end of a raising. People tired and satisfied and moving slower. Conversations longer. The tension of the work loosening into companionship. Ruth was gathering the empty breadcloths from the table when Frau Troyer said she was going to ride back with the Coons, whose buggy went past the Troyer farm, and that Ruth was welcome to do the same. Ruth said she would walk. The evening was clear, the road was good, and she wanted the air after a long day in company. She took the field road which cut off a 1/4 mile, following it between 2 fence rows through the low pasture and up toward the Troyer lane. It was a road she had begun to know, having walked it twice before on errand days, and she moved through it easily in the settling light. She did not expect the fence. More precisely, she had not expected to find a man at the fence on her way past it. The post and rail that marked the eastern edge of the Schrock property ran along the left side of the field road for perhaps 50 yards, and there was a gate in it that you had to lift because the latch pin was bent, and it would not work the way a latch pin was meant to work. She had noticed it the first time she had come this way. The gate that needed lifting had lifted it and gone through and thought nothing more of it. Elias was at the fence when she came around the slope of the hill, checking a post that had listed in the spring thaw. He had not heard her on the soft ground and looked up when she was still a few yards off, and there was a moment of simple, mutual surprise. 2 people who had not arranged to be here, who were here nonetheless. Ruth slowed but did not stop. "Evening," she said. "Evening," he said. She reached the gate and put her hand on it and lifted it the way she had learned, getting the angle right, and swung it open and stepped through and turned to close it behind her. He watched without offering to help, and she did not need him to. Then he said, "The latch on that gate's been needing fixing for 2 years." She said, "Some things wait." She did not know exactly what she meant by that, or whether she meant it about the gate specifically, or about something else. She only knew it was true, and that she had said it, and that it was out in the air between them now. He didn't answer. She looked at him once more, briefly, and he was looking at the gate, rather than at her, and his face was the face of a man thinking something that he had no particular intention of saying. She walked on. The field road ran out into the Troyer lane, and she followed it home in the last of the light, the sky going pale orange above the tree line to the west, the first star coming in above the hill to the east. She did not think specifically about the conversation. It had barely been a conversation. 40 words between 2 people on a country road at the end of a long day. But she thought about the gate that had been needing fixing for 2 years. She thought about how some things wait, and whether that was patience or something else, whether there was, in the end, a meaningful difference. She did not think about Elias Schrock. She was quite sure of this. She walked home and fed the sourdough starter and went to bed. Canning season in Holmes County was not a solitary event. It could not have been, even if any of the women had wanted it that way, which they did not, because the purpose of canning season was not only to fill the cellar shelves, but to fill them together. The work divided sensibly across households so that no one woman was standing over a boiling kettle alone for 3 weeks, and the talk and the company and the shared load of it all being, in its way, as necessary as the quarts of tomatoes at the end. Ruth found herself included without ceremony. Frau Troyer vouched for her hands and her competence turned out to be its own endorsement. She could put up a water bath correctly and reliably and without drama. She could work a paring knife quickly and without waste. She could manage 3 things at once on a stove and know which one needed her attention most. These were not small things in a canning kitchen. She worked in 4 different households before she worked in the Schrock kitchen. It was arranged, as these arrangements were, without being arranged. The district's informal rotation simply arrived at the Schrock farm on a Wednesday in late July, and Ruth was part of the group of 4 women who came, along with 2 baskets of tomatoes and a flat of green beans from the Coons' garden. Elias had been told they were coming. He had cleared out of the kitchen before they arrived, which Ruth noted and said nothing about. The kitchen was hot and fragrant by mid-morning, and Jonas, who apparently could not be kept anywhere he didn't want to be, was underfoot with the cheerful persistence of a 5-year-old who has decided he is helping. Miriam worked beside the women with the seriousness of a girl who wanted to be taken seriously, and she was, because her knife work was already good, and she did not make the mistake of pretending to know things she did not know. Levi stayed outside. Or he stayed outside until around mid-afternoon, when he came in for water and then did not go back out. He sat at the chair by the window, the one Ruth had noticed on her first visit, and he read a book and did not appear to watch what was happening in the kitchen. But Ruth had learned by now something about how Levi Schrock paid attention. He paid it the way certain careful people do, without making it obvious, which is to say he was watching everything. She did not alter what she was doing for his benefit. She worked the way she always worked, steadily and without flourish, talking with the other women about the season and the garden yields, and whether anyone was going to put up more beet relish this year, or whether the general consensus was that everyone already had enough beet relish to last until Jonas Schrock had grandchildren. She was not performing. She was just there. The bread happened because the morning had been long and the afternoon's work still stretched out ahead, and Ruth had the starter with her. She had brought it in Frau Troyer's canning bag out of habit, and a faint plan, and the timing was right. She asked Frau Schrock. There was, of course, no Frau Schrock. She asked the kitchen in general if anyone objected to bread being made alongside the canning, and no one did. She built the dough quietly at the end of the counter that was not being used, hands working the flour and water, and starter together in the way she had done since she was 7. The whole thing unhurried, the dough answering her in the way good dough does when it is being handled by someone who understands it. She shaped the loaves and set them to rise, and went back to the tomatoes. By 4 o'clock the bread was in the oven, and Jonas had stationed himself directly in front of the oven door. "It's not ready," Ruth told him. "I know," Jonas said. He did not move. She let him stay. When the loaves came out, she cut the first one while it was still almost too hot, which you are not really supposed to do. And Jonas ate 3 slices with butter and said, without any apparent self-consciousness, that it was the best thing he had ever had in his entire life. Ruth laughed. She had not laughed in a while, and it surprised her slightly, the ease of it, the way it had been there without her noticing. She looked up and found Miriam grinning at her, and she looked further to the chair by the window and found Levi looking at the bread on the counter. And then, when he felt her eyes on him, looking back at his book. The other women went home at 6. Ruth stayed to help clean the kitchen because it was her nature to, and because the work was not quite done. Elias came in from the shop while she was washing the last of the kettles, said good evening to her back, and asked if she needed anything. She said she did not. She heard him fill his cup from the stovepat and stand somewhere behind her, and the room was quiet except for the water. She went home in the early evening light, the empty mason jar rinsed and wrapped in her bag, The following week, she was at the Troyer table sewing when she heard footsteps on the porch, and Frau Troyer went to the door and came back and said it was the Schrock boy. Ruth looked up from her work. Levi was in the doorway, hat in hand, standing straight. He looked at Ruth with the same careful, measuring look she had come to know, and then he said plainly, "My dad said to ask if you had any more of that bread." Ruth looked at him for a moment. She said, "I can make some. Would Thursday do?" Levi said Thursday would do. He said it carefully, without expression, the way you might say a neutral thing. But he had said it. He had come here on his own feet to ask, not Miriam, not Jonas, who would have come dancing up the lane without any encouragement. Levi. He put his hat back on and walked back down the lane, and Ruth watched him go until Frau Troyer's quiet presence behind her made her aware that she was standing at the door, watching a 12-year-old boy walk home. She went back to her sewing. She picked up the hem she had been working and set it back down. She reached for the small cloth she used to wipe her needle and folded it once, and then again, edges meeting exactly, and sat for a moment with it flat under her palm. The wall, she thought, had a crack in it now. She did not know what to do with that yet. She did not know if she was allowed to know. But a boy had walked 1.5 miles to ask for her bread, and something in her, something she had kept very carefully folded away, turned quietly toward the light. October in Holmes County arrives without apology. The maples go first, then the oaks, and for 2 weeks the hills are the color of something burning, and then the cold comes and takes it all, and the hills are gray again, and the community turns inward toward the serious business of preparing the soul for winter. Council meeting fell on the second Saturday of October that year, held in the Kame barn, which was large enough and had been used for this purpose for as long as most members could remember. It was not a dramatic occasion, not in the way that outsiders sometimes imagine plain community governance to be dramatic. It was quiet and methodical and serious in the way that serious things are serious when the people doing them mean it. Members were asked one by one whether they were at peace with God and with the community, whether they had any unresolved matter of conscience, whether they were prepared to receive communion in the old way, as their forebears had received it, in the knowledge that to receive it unworthily was a weighty thing. Elias Schrock, as deacon, sat at the front and assisted Bishop Levi Keem in the examination, which meant that he asked the questions he had asked before, in previous years, with a steady voice and a steady face, and listened to the answers and kept his own counsel. This was his office, and he understood it. He had been ordained to it 8 years ago, before Anna was sick, when he had been a younger man with a full house and a clear conscience and a straightforward understanding of what faithfulness required. He was less certain of that last thing now. It was not a crisis of faith. He wanted to be precise about this, even in the privacy of his own thinking. He believed what he had always believed. The ordnung was right. The community was good. The God who had taken Anna was the same God who had given her to him in the first place. And Elias had made his accounting with that, had sat with it in the long nights of her illness and the longer nights after, and had arrived at something that was not peace exactly, but was its neighbor. What he had not accounted for was Ruth Beiler. He did not dramatize it, even in his own mind, because dramatizing things was not in his character. He simply noticed, with the precision of a man who worked with his hands and expected things to fit or not fit, that something had shifted. He noticed that he looked for her in the room on Sunday mornings. He noticed that he had found a reason, twice, to be in the yard when she might be walking the field road. He noticed that when Levi had come home from the Troyers and reported with careful neutrality that Thursday would do for the bread, Elias had felt something he had no immediate word for, and that he had not felt in 2 years. None of this was sin. He was clear about that too. He was a widower. She was a widow. The community did not forbid it. The Ordnung did not speak against it. There was no impropriety. There was only the question of whether he was a man who still had the right to want something, and that question was harder than it looked. After the formal meeting, when the members had dispersed and the cane barn was emptying into the cool October afternoon, Bishop Levi Kame found Elias by the water trough, not doing anything in particular, which for Elias was itself a kind of signal. The bishop was 63 years old and had been in his office for 19 of them. He was not a tall man, but he had the quality of stillness that made him seem larger than he was, and he had the particular wisdom of someone who had learned to say less than he knew and mean more than he said. He stood beside Elias and looked at the same middle distance Elias was looking at, and they were quiet for a moment in the way of men who have known each other long enough that silence is not uncomfortable. Then the bishop said, "You did well today." Elias said, "I said what needed saying." The bishop said, "You always do." He paused. "There are other things worth saying too, in their time." He didn't look at Elias when he said it. He just let it sit there in the air, the way the bishop let things sit, and then he said he should get back to his wife and walked away. Elias stood there for another few minutes. The water in the trough was very still. He could see the sky in it, pale blue and going cold. There are men who confuse endurance with faithfulness. Elias Schrock had been confusing them for 2 years. He had believed that bearing his grief without complaint and managing his household without help and asking nothing of anyone was the same as living rightly. He had believed that wanting something for himself, something beyond the barn and the shop and the 3 children and the office he held, was a kind of indulgence. Council meeting had a way, in Holmes County, of making a man sit with himself long enough to see the difference. Endurance was what you did when the weight was on you, and there was no way through but through. Faithfulness was something larger than that. It had room in it for the living, not only for the bearing of loss. He drove home in the buggy in the gray October afternoon, and he thought about a woman who folded dish towels and kept her bread starter alive through 2 years of grief and said some things wait, with a simplicity that had been sitting in him for 4 months like a stone in still water. He thought about it for a long time. Levi had not meant to see. It was a Thursday night in early November, and the house was dark except for the lamp in the harness shop, which Levi could see from his bedroom window as a thin line of gold along the bottom of the closed door. His father worked late sometimes. It was not unusual. Levi had woken for water and gone to the kitchen and come back and seen the light and thought nothing of it. He was at the top of the stairs when he heard the shop door open, and some instinct he could not have explained made him stop rather than continue to his room. His father came into the kitchen. He did not light the main lamp. He stood in the kitchen in the dark with the shop lamp in his hand, and the light from it moved across the walls the way lantern light does, soft and alive. And Elias stood at the kitchen table and set the lamp down and reached into his coat pocket and took out something small. It was a folded piece of paper. Levi could see it was small, folded in thirds, the kind of folding that might come from being tucked into a basket or slipped between breadcloths. He had not seen it before. He did not know when it had come, or how. His father unfolded it and read it, and Levi could not see his face fully, only the angle of it and the lamp below throwing the light up rather than down. But he could see enough. He hadn't seen his father look like that. He had seen his father tired, and he had seen him purposeful, and he had seen him the way he was in church, contained and correct, and he had seen him once, at the graveside, in a way that Levi had stored very carefully in a part of his memory that he did not visit. But he had not seen this. This was not grief, and it was not tiredness. It was something quieter and more complicated, and it scared Levi in a way he did not immediately understand. He went to his room without making any noise. He lay in the dark for a long time. Then he got up and went to Miriam's room and opened the door quietly. Miriam was still awake, reading by the small lamp on her nightstand, and she looked up with the unsurprised expression of a 9-year-old who considers herself unbothered by most things. Levi sat on the edge of her bed. He didn't know exactly how to say what he wanted to say, so he said the part he could reach. "Do you think Ma'am would have liked her?" he said. "The lady from Troyer's." Miriam did not hesitate. She closed her book over her thumb to keep the place, and looked at her brother with her direct Schrock eyes and said, simply, "Yeah." Levi looked at his hands. "She would have liked the bread," Miriam added. "Ma'am always said good bread was worth more than it costs." It was such a specific thing to say, so exactly the kind of thing their mother would have said, that Levi felt it in his chest in a way he was not prepared for. He sat there for another moment without speaking, and Miriam did not push him because she understood her brother better than he knew. Then he said good night and went back to his room and lay down in the dark. And he did not sleep for a while. But when he did sleep, it was without the careful watchfulness he had been carrying for 2 years, without the sense that he needed to remain alert, that something needed guarding. For the first time in a long time, he simply slept. The November wedding was for a young couple from the south end of the district, a Yoder boy marrying a Troyer girl, which meant that half the district was related to one or both of them, and the other half had known them since they were in the schoolhouse together, and the gathering was, in that way, not just a celebration of 2 people, but of the whole web of connection that held the community in its shape. It was held on a Tuesday, in the large way of Amish weddings. The house opened and extended with temporary benches, the singing long in the morning and the meal generous in the afternoon. Ruth sat with the women and helped serve and accepted a plate, and ate beside Frau Troyer, and felt for the first time in perhaps a year the specific texture of being part of something, not a guest, not a boarder, something closer to a member of the fabric. She had cried during the singing. She had not expected to. The voices in an Amish wedding, unaccompanied and slow and layered with the weight of generations, had done something to her that she could not have predicted and could not stop. So she let it happen quietly, looking straight ahead, and Frau Troyer had put one hand briefly over hers on the bench and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. The crying was grief, partly. It was always partly grief. But it was also something she had not let herself feel in a long time, some upwelling of the living part of her, the part that had not died with everyone else, the part that had been watching the past year with interest and care, and something like hunger. And it frightened her a little, because she had gotten accustomed to its silence. She did not see Elias during the meal except at a distance. He was at the men's table, and she was among the women, and that was proper, and she was not looking for him. She helped with the clearing up afterward and put on her coat in the cooling afternoon, and told Frau Troyer she would walk back. She wanted the air. And Frau Troyer looked at her in the particular way Frau Troyer had that suggested she knew more than she said, and told her to wear her scarf. Ruth walked the road in the low November light, the sky a soft pewter above the brown fields, her breath going white in the cold. She did not decide to take the field road. She simply found herself on it which amounted to the same thing. She came to the fence in the late afternoon stillness, and she stopped. The gate was there. The post and rail gate with the bent latch pin. The same gate she had lifted and passed through in June. She stopped beside it and put her hand on the top rail and stood there, not going anywhere, just standing. The field on the other side was bare and quiet. The harness shop was maybe 60 yards off, the lamp in the window just beginning to matter as the light outside faded. She was not sure what she was doing. She folded the corner of her apron with her free hand, pressing the edge flat, and then she was aware of it and she stopped, and she kept her hand still, and she stood there in the cold and looked at the gate. She heard the shop door. She did not turn. She heard his footsteps on the frozen ground, unhurried, and then they stopped, and she knew he was there. "You're on the wrong side of the gate," Elias said. "I know," Ruth said. She turned then. He was perhaps 10 feet away, standing in his work coat, hatted against the cold, his hands at his sides. He was looking at her the way he had looked at the folded note. She understood suddenly, the way she had not seen him look at her before, without the formal distance he usually kept, without the careful nothing of his expression. She said, "You do that when you're trying not to say something." She realized as she said it that she had meant it about herself, that she had confused whose observation it was. He said, "What?" "Nothing," she said. "I was talking to myself." He came closer then, not quickly. 3 or 4 steps, and he stopped on his side of the fence. The gate was between them or beside them, neither of them having moved to open it. He said, "I saw you in the church this morning, during the singing." Ruth looked at the gate rail. "I imagine several people saw me." "I imagine they did," he said. He paused. "It wasn't a small thing, what I saw, but it wasn't an embarrassing one either. I thought you ought to know that." She looked at him then, directly, and found him looking back with the same directness, and the quality of it was different from his usual looking. It was a man who had decided something and was now simply telling the truth. The cold was coming down harder as the light went. The field behind him was going gray, the tree line darkening. Ruth said, "I don't know what I'm doing standing at this fence." Elias said, "I expect you know better than you're letting on." She was quiet for a moment. The gate was solid under her hand, the wood cold and rough grain. She said, "I've buried everyone who ever knew me well. My mother, my father, my brother, my husband, all of them. I've had it in my head, for a long time now, that there is something about my nearness that is costly for people. That is not a rational thought. I know it isn't rational." "No," he said gently. "It isn't. But I have it," she said. "And I thought you ought to know that too, since we're saying things." Elias was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the field and found them where they stood, and neither of them shifted. He said, "I have 3 children who need something I am not able to give them on my own. I am not telling you that as an argument. I'm telling you because it's true, and because you deserve the plain version of things." He paused. "I don't want to watch you leave this county in the spring." The words were not romantic in the way of English stories. They were plain, and they were honest, and they had the weight of a man who had chosen them carefully, who had not said them until he was certain they were the ones he meant. Ruth stood with her hand on the cold fence rail and looked at Elias Schrock in the November dusk and felt something in her chest that she had kept folded away for a very long time come slowly, carefully, open. She said, "I have a sourdough starter that belonged to my mother. I've been keeping it alive for 2 years. I have not kept it alive to watch it sit in a window at Troyer's forever. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, no great expression. Just the settling of a man who has been holding tension in his shoulders for a very long time and has let some of it go. He reached past the gate. His hand closed on the latchpin, the bent one, the one that had not worked in 2 years, and he worked it with a mechanic's patience until it gave, cleanly the pin setting into place. He pushed the gate open and held it. Ruth walked through. She went home in the dark with her scarf around her face and her hands in her pockets, and the cold coming fully down across the county, and she did not fold anything the entire way home. She just walked, straight and steady, through the dark. Elias spoke to his children on a Sunday afternoon in mid-November, when the house was quiet and the outside work was done, and there was nowhere any of them needed to be. He had thought carefully about what to say, and had arrived at the conclusion that the truth, plainly told, was better than the careful version, because his children were not foolish, and Levi in particular would see through anything that was carefully constructed. He sat them at the kitchen table. Jonas had a piece of bread in his hand and was not concerned about anything. Miriam sat straight and waited with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular conversation for some time. Levi sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on his father, and Elias looked at him first, because Levi was the one that mattered most in this. He said that they knew Ruth Beiler, who had been boarding with the Troyers. He said that she was a good woman with a difficult history, and that he had come to have a regard for her, and that he intended, with the bishop's proper involvement, to pursue the question of whether they might make a life together. He said it simply and without flourish, the way he said everything. Jonas said, "Will she bring more bread?" Miriam said, "Where would she sleep? Would she have Mam's room?" Elias said those were fair questions, and they would work through all of them as things developed. He looked at Levi. Levi had not said anything. He was looking at the table, which Elias allowed, because Levi needed room to think, and always had. After a moment, Levi raised his eyes. He said, "Will she still know that Mam was here?" Elias held his son's gaze. He said, "This whole house knows it, every corner of it, and so will she." He meant it absolutely. He had not loved Anna less because she was gone. He had not put her in the past the way you put a thing in a drawer. She was in the boards of the floor, and the pattern of the quilt, and the way Miriam held her fork, and the memory Levi was so faithfully keeping. Nothing was being taken. Nothing was being replaced. Levi looked at his father for a long moment, weighing something in that private, precise way of his. Then he nodded once, a small and serious nod, the kind that closed a matter. Miriam immediately began asking about the bread. Jonas fell asleep against Elias's arm before the conversation was finished, the bread still in his hand. In the background, on the guest bed that was not used for guests, the blue and white Ohio star quilt lay folded and still, and the late afternoon light moved across it through the window. The arrangement was made quietly and in the proper way, which was to say that Elias spoke to Bishop Keim, and Bishop Keim spoke to Frau Troyer, and Frau Troyer spoke to Ruth, and Ruth listened with her hands still in her lap and said yes. There was no courtship in the English sense of the word, no series of meetings designed to establish feeling that was already established, no performance of uncertainty that would have been dishonest. What there was instead was a series of deliberate and plain steps taken by two adults who understood exactly what they were doing and why, in the presence of a community that witnessed such things and held them. A spring wedding was decided on. Not the traditional November, since November was already past, and not because there was any unseemly rush, but because waiting for another full year made no practical sense that either of them could honestly defend. The bishop found this reasonable. The community, for the most part, found it reasonable. Sadie Yoder, who was a genuinely good woman, brought Ruth a jar of her best strawberry preserves in December and said she hoped Ruth would be happy here, and she said it without visible difficulty, and Ruth received it with gratitude and with the respect the gesture deserved. December settled over Holmes County in its usual way, cold and clear and still, the snow finally coming and meaning it, covering the fields in the white silence that lasted until March. The Schrock farm lay under it with the particular look of a place that is waiting, not emptily but with intention, the way land waits when it knows what is coming. Ruth came to the Schrock house 3 times in December, with the bishop's sanction and Frau Treuer as company, which was proper. And on the 3rd visit she was in the kitchen helping Miriam with the dishes, when she looked up and found Levi standing in the doorway with something in his hands. It was his mother's recipe book, a plain cloth-covered notebook, the kind you could buy at the market in Millersburg, filled with Anna Schrock's handwriting in the careful, even script that Levi apparently remembered very well, because he held it as carefully as that. He said, without preamble, "She had a way with dried apple cake. Dad says it was her best thing. I thought you might want to know how she did it." He held the book out. Ruth looked at it and then at the boy, and she took it with both hands and held it the same way he had. She said, "Thank you, Levi." He said, "You can make it different if you want." He paused, "But you should know what it was first." He went back to whatever he had been doing, and Ruth stood with the recipe book and felt the weight of it, which wasn't the weight of paper and cloth, but something older and heavier, and also, somehow, lighter than she had expected. It was the 1st week of January when she moved into the Schrock house formally, ahead of the spring wedding date, because the practical matters of a household with 3 children and a farm and a harness business were not well served by her remaining at Treuer's for another 4 months, and everyone involved understood this. The bishop had satisfied himself on the matter of propriety and said nothing further about it, which, from Bishop came, was its own form of blessing. She was given her own room on the 2nd floor, across from where Miriam slept. It was not Anna's room. This had been decided without it being made a discussion. She brought her trunk and her canvas bag, and the mason jar wrapped in a dish towel wedged in the corner, the sourdough starter that had crossed from Mifflin County to Holmes County and had been fed every Tuesday and Saturday without fail. Alive the way living things insist on being alive when someone takes the trouble to care for them. She set the jar on the windowsill of her room where the morning light would reach it. In the weeks that followed, the house changed the way a house changes when a person who knows what a house needs is in it. Not dramatically, not by way of announcement. The bread appeared regularly, and Jonas treated this as the natural order of things. The mending pile was addressed. The curtains in the main room were washed and rehung without anyone asking. Miriam began spending her evenings at the kitchen table instead of her room, because the kitchen was, again, the kind of place you wanted to be in the evening. Levi watched all of this. He did not comment on it. But he set the table every night, the way he always had, and one evening in February he put Ruth's cup on the table without being asked, not in his mother's place, in a new place, to the right of where Elias sat, a place that had not been anyone's place before. He set it there and he put the spoons out, and he called Jonas in from the cold, and when Ruth came to the table, he was already seated, looking at nothing in particular, his face its customary careful arrangement. Ruth looked at the cup in its new place. She did not say anything about it. She sat down and poured her tea, and the family came to the table around her in the ordinary way of families gathering, Jonas loud and Miriam precise, and Elias quiet and steady at the head of it, and the kitchen was warm, and the bread was cut, and the evening was what evenings are supposed to be, full and plain and abiding. On the guest bed in the room at the end of the hall, the Ohio star quilt lay clean and neatly folded. Ruth had washed it herself, carefully, the way you wash something you intend to last. She had not done it to remove anything. She had done it because it was Anna's, and Anna's things deserved to be cared for, and caring for them was something Ruth understood how to do. She sat at her sewing table by the window after supper that night, in the lamplight with Jonas's shirt in her hands. A seam had come loose at the shoulder, the way small boys' seams always do, and she was setting it right. Her hands worked the needle through the cloth steadily, the thimble familiar on her finger, the thread catching the light. She folded the mended edge and pressed it flat with her thumb, checking her work. And then she set the shirt in her lap and looked out the window at the winter night, the snow-covered fields going away from the house in the darkness, the stars very clear and cold above the tree line. She had come to Holmes County the way snow comes in mud season, quietly, without announcement, not at all sure she would stay. She had carried her losses with her the way she carried the starter jar, carefully against her side, one more thing she had promised to keep alive. She had not expected the ground to be ready for her. She had not expected ground to be ready for her anywhere, ever again. But the ground was ready. It had been waiting, in its cold and patient way, all along. The story of Ruth Beiler and Elias Schrock is not a story about forgetting. Not one of the dead are forgotten in it. Anna Schrock is in the boards of that floor, and the pattern of that quilt and the recipe book on the kitchen shelf. Daniel Beiler and Ruth's parents and her brother Amos are in the bread she makes from her mother's starter. The bread that crossed a state line in a mason jar, wrapped in a dish towel. Because some things are worth carrying even when carrying them is hard. What this story is about is the plain, quietly radical act of deciding that your life is not over, because the people you loved are gone. Of understanding that building something new with the same hands that held what was taken is not a betrayal of the dead. In the Amish understanding of stewardship, nothing that was given to you belongs to you alone, including your grief, including your years, including the particular thing you have to offer the people who are still here and still in need of it. Ruth Beiler learned in Holmes County, in the year she stopped folding herself away, that faithfulness is larger than endurance. It has room in it for the living. That is worth knowing. Wherever you are sitting tonight, that is worth knowing. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it waiting. Subscribe, and I'll see you next time.